No man do they call me. My mother and my father, and all my comrades as well. Hey everybody, No Man here, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a pretty commonly discussed topic. I wanted to talk about Mary Sue's and Gary Stu's. Or more accurately, I don't want to talk about them anymore. Let me explain. Ever since Paula Smith wrote A Trekkie's Tale featuring the original Mary Sue in 1973, the character trope has been floating around fandoms ever since. I'm not going to go super into depth on the definition of what a Mary Sue, or what a Marty Stew is, but suffice to say that they tend to be obnoxious, overpowered author self-inserts. Frequently, they show up in fan fictions. Uh, People have discussed the trope in depth, why it's a problem, how to avoid writing Mary Sue-ish characters, etc. Now, I enjoy laughing at Mary Sue's or Gary Stu's as much as anybody else, and 40K is certainly a setting that oozes Gary Stu energy, but I think that the concept of the Mary Sue is becoming an obstacle to people who are trying to learn how to write good characters. Frequently, people spend more time trying to make their characters, quote unquote, not a Mary Sue, instead of focusing on what's happening in the story, what the actions of their character, what they ought to be doing, what is their history, what's their personality, are you paying attention to the pacing and tone in your story, all the other things that go into making a decent story. If you're trying to figure out what flaws you should give your character specifically to make them less Sue-ish or Stew-ish, you're already not thinking about your character in the most productive way. I sort of illustrated this with my bad writing prompt videos that I've done at this point to try to point out dramatically and illustrate how you can take a very Mary Sue-ish character concept and with, a little bit of thought and some passable writing, you can explore a concept that could be interesting. People should be focusing on who their character is, what they're trying to accomplish, what obstacles they're trying to face, etc., instead of being preoccupied with whether or not their character is seen as a Sue or a Stew. There are tons of great stories that are told about characters who have most of the qualities of a Sue or a Stew. Wolverine is an edgy badass who plays by his own rules and has a traumatic backstory. He's a bioengineered weapon with mega cool claws. He's incredibly edgy, and that pun is very much intended. And sometimes he is basically a great big Gary Stew. But there are stories about Wolverine that are compelling. And there are plenty of moral paragon sort of characters who don't really have moral failings or flaws. Superman, Captain America, Gandalf, Yoda, these characters don't really grow morally. They don't really change their core character at all. They stick to their principles, and it has much more to do with how their story is told, in my mind, than the need for flaws. I think the most commonly discussed Mary Sue on the internet right now is Rey from the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I think most of the criticism that's leveled at her goes along the lines of she's way too powerful, she has no flaws, she didn't need to train, she's too overpowered, and she's a Mary Sue. Those issues cause some problems with Rey, especially because we don't get a satisfying in-universe explanation as to why she's so powerful, aside from the fact that she's Palpatine's granddaughter, as revealed in the very last movie. Which is something I could discuss at length as to the problems with that, but I'm not going to go into that in this video for the sake of brevity. People say that Rey fails because she's powerful. I think that's an issue that could be dealt with fairly easily. It wouldn't take much to have her struggle a bit, give her a montage, have her learn some things, or get a bit of an explanation as to why she's so powerful, or hint at it early on. To me, the reason she fails as a character, fundamentally, is because the Star Wars sequel trilogy is bad at setting up and dealing with consequences. Let's back it up a little bit. So let's talk about an extremely simple story. Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is going to Grandma's house with a bag of goodies. She runs across the big bad wolf. Red tells him that she's going to go visit Grandma to give her goodies. The wolf runs off to Grandma's house ahead of Red to eat Grandma and eventually eat Red while in disguise as the Grandma. This is an extremely simple story, but there are some basic story elements that make it work on a very simple level. We get that Red is a good girl. She's trying to do something nice for Grandma. The wolf is bad. He wants to eat Red and Grandma. The situation is created where the audience is worried about the safety of our heroine and her grandmother. Even though we don't really know anything about her, and she has no great character flaws aside from that she's a naive child, we have the very basic building blocks that make us care about her. In the case of the sequel Star Wars, and many stories in my opinion, I think the much bigger problem is a complete lack of cause, effect, and consequence. The characters exist, but nothing anyone does seems to matter. The Empire is destroyed. It doesn't matter. The First Order shows up without explanation. The core systems of the Republic are destroyed. We never learn anything about the consequences of a dozen planets getting blown up. Starkiller Base is destroyed, and the next movie opens up with the First Order dominating the galaxy and the Resistance is down to a few ships. There's no consistency in the world. There's no clear cause and effect. And because of this, the actions of the characters don't really matter. Everything just seems to happen to keep the story awkwardly plotting forward from meaningless plot point to meaningless plot point, with the nonsensical decisions of the characters resulting in nonsensical consequences. To me, that is the major problem with the sequel trilogy, and I think people are focusing too much on Rey as a Mary Sue. People certainly talk about other things, but I think the big things people are upset about are Rey being really powerful and then making Luke Skywalker a bitter old man and not handling his character well. And I don't think those are the biggest problems of those series. I think that's actually relatively easy to fix if you change not that many things. Now, I know people have been discussing the trend of powerful female characters in media. There's a lot of political drama tied up in these kind of discussions, which I kind of want to avoid. I similarly think that this is a distraction. If you have, you can have extremely political movies that are still very good. They Live, RoboCop, Star Trek, those are all very political. Heck, Mad Max Fury Road, a very widely loved movie, is full of strong female characters. The bad guys are all embodiments of toxic masculinity and corrupt capitalism. It's a very left-leaning movie, but even people who don't agree politically with what it's saying enjoy it because it's a compelling story with characters that we care about. Now, I'm not the end-all, be-all of literary or film criticism. This is just how I see things. But I think people are getting distracted from the issues in films that touch on their political ideologies. And I think it's incredibly important that you kind of step away a little bit from your political views to kind of analyze a little bit more thoughtfully. I mean, you might believe very, very ardently that it's incredibly important for there to be more diversity in films. You can find yourself then supporting poor quality films because they're satisfying your political leanings on a superficial level. Similarly, I think people can misidentify forced diversity as the reason why certain stories or characters don't work. They're just as much distracted by their own political leanings. Getting away from politics, I want to get back to the original discussion, Gary Stews and Mary Sues. They're funny tropes, and it can be a good laugh to read them in bad fan fictions. However, I think people can have their ability to critically assess works become warped because they're stuck thinking in terms of Mary Sue's, Gary Stews, forced diversity, toxic masculinity, queer representation, or whatever. Not that you can't discuss those issues, but if you're a writer, you really need to be focusing on making your characters and your story compelling. If you're a reader or a critic, you need to develop a better understanding of literary elements and why things don't work instead of focusing on things that are more commonly discussed in fan fiction circles instead of among professional writers. So yeah, anyway, this was just something that was on my brain recently, and I figured I'd share my thoughts. This isn't really a comment on the criticisms people have provided me with my work. People have actually been very constructive with their criticism, and I very much appreciate that. This is more my observations of internet and film literary criticism in general. Anyway, I thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed my weird little rant. No man out.